Here in Chapter 8, we're going to take a look at some of the issues that go into deciphering and making sense of information on the internet through a critical thinking lens. I have heard, just through people saying it, I can't really attribute the quote to anybody, that the internet is an ocean of information ankle deep. Meaning that a lot of the information that you have out there isn't very deep. It's not credible. It's hard to track down. It's not very robust. It just lacks the oomph of good information. Now, is there good information on the internet? Absolutely there is. There are lots of ways that we can get good information that's credible. The sources are credible and the information makes sense. It's reasonable information, but by and large, a lot of the information that we see out there is not good, and if we're not careful, we will fall prey to it. So let's take a look at some of the outcomes that we have for this chapter. And even though there are only 3 outcomes, it's a pretty big deal to be able to walk through this. And what's nice is that at the end of this chapter, you're going to have a model that you can work from to be able to decipher information that you read on the internet, to evaluate it and judge it whether it's good information or not. So first is identify potential problems and benefits of using information from the internet. Then we're going to critically evaluate internet sources for credibility, accuracy, reasonableness, and evidence. And if you are observant, you'll recognize that CARE has an acronym for CARE. Isn't that nice? I always love when we have these cute little acronyms that, sound like they're warm and huggy and everything. And then the last is that we're going to decide whether internet claims about a therapy should be believed. And this is based on an exercise toward the end of the chapter. And there are going to be these little micro exercises along the way that will help you to get into the rhythm for evaluating this research to be good or not, or the research or the therapy to be good or not. So let's start off with a what do you think? And pardon me, this slide's a little bit tricky because it's small, but let me read this to you, and then we'll answer a couple questions about it. So, dear promising college student, hey, we're all promising college students. You've been selected to be featured in the upcoming edition of Who's Outstanding Among Undergraduates. You are receiving the singular honor because you have already provided a valuable contribution to your college or university. Every year, our team of experts searches for and recognizes those college students whose academic achievement, extracurricular activity, or service to their institution is outstanding. Many college students who are selected consider this to be one of the highest accolades they receive in their college career. Publishing your achievement is our way of honoring you, so your inclusion in the book is absolutely free. To help us complete your entry in this year's registry, please click on the following link to complete the brief biographical questionnaire. Once again, congratulations on your achievement. Sincerely, David Gormich, Senior Editor, Who's Who in Undergraduates Incorporated. Okay. So imagine you received that letter. What do you think? How do you know if you can trust the information you find on the internet? Okay. So how do you know that this thing that comes across, this letter, can be trusted? This is an email that comes to you. It's based on information that was gathered from the internet. Okay. This is not a real pointed email just to you. It's to pretty much anybody, even though it try to make you feel special. So this is gathering information about you, where you go to school maybe, and being able to find some information about email addresses that it can mine. Okay, so what questions do you ask about that letter that you just read that help you evaluate the information that's in that letter, which was taken from the internet? All right, how would you know if something like this or a therapy that is described on the internet is a good one? So how do you know if that information is valid? How do you know if the information in that letter is for you, if it's for everybody, if it is a singular honor, or what their end game is? And then what are the advantages and disadvantages of using the internet for this kind of information? What's interesting about this is that Who's Who in Undergraduates is an actual thing. It's not called Who's Who in Undergraduates. I think it's like Who's Who Among College Students or something like that. But there are several of these organizations that go around sending out emails and letters to people who've been admitted into college and things like that. And what they will do is they will say, yes, you're going to be in this book. It's going to be free. Fill out this card. And then once you get there, you are offered different pay levels to be able to get copies of the book or electronic copies or whatever it is. And that's how they make money. And the reality is that these books are pretty much garbage because it has anybody in there who is willing to provide any information about themselves and probably just pay a little bit of money to get the copy of it, so that maybe theirs is bold or whatever it is. I don't know. So these are pretty much useless, but it's junk mail. But we don't recognize it that way, especially when something is flattering. Like if somebody says to you, "You're receiving the singular honor because you have already provided a valuable contribution to your college or university." Okay. Probably not, because they're targeting usually first semester freshmen. And although first semester freshmen are quite capable of making significant contributions to the college or university, they haven't done it yet. And generally it's something like you've made a contribution to your school. Parenthetically, you paid tuition, so that's actually one of the best contributions anybody can make, right? Paying tuition. You got to keep the doors open and everything. But these letters that come out are not very helpful. Okay. So people do believe these things. It's very interesting, and lots of times people will say, you can't believe everything on the internet. Well, it's true. You can believe some things, but not all things. So the tricky part is, what do you believe? There are people out there who will say, well, I'm not going to believe anything on the internet because you can't trust it. Okay, that means that you're not using critical thinking, because what you're doing is you're using this gross generalization about the internet when it can actually be helpful. I think that one of the sillier things I've heard about this, who again kind of is unattributable quote, is that you can't believe everything you hear on the internet. That's how World War II got started. Right? Clearly, that's kind of just a tongue-in-cheek way of saying that the internet is quite unreliable in many cases, but it can be helpful in some cases. That's the trick. So what are the benefits of the internet? Well, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of information on the internet that can be helpful. All right, a lot of information that can help us make informed decisions, a lot of information that can inform us on a topic. Whatever it is probably on the internet. And you can probably have reasonable access to it. There's some things that are kind of like behind paywalls and different registration and things like that, but generally you can get a hold of good information on the internet if you want to seek it out. Unfortunately, you can also get a hold of garbage information in the midst of trying to seek out good information. Okay. What else is nice about it is that it's widely publishable. So things in the internet are widely publishable. You have access to lots of different things quickly, which is also the problem with the internet, right? Because that means that anybody who wants to develop a website can develop a website, and if it gets enough traffic and it gets bumped to the top of your Google when you are doing a search, then all of a sudden you think that, oh, a lot of people go here, it shows up first, it must be a good website. So it can be helpful to get information out there to everybody, but the problem is that you're getting all the information out there to everybody and people don't discern the information. Some disadvantages of the internet, kind of the flip side of the other ones. We do get a lot of information and it can be too much. All right, so what happens is that if we have some kind of information overload, we may choose to use heuristics in order to cut through the information in a way that's not a really good critical approach. What's interesting is that I think the internet, Google's a little bit different now in that they don't have like pages of searches. Now it's just continuous, where when you get to the bottom of the page, it loads more. So this phenomenon has kind of gone away. But usually what happens is that if you search for something on Google and whatever you're searching for doesn't appear on the first page of results, it's not going to be found. People don't go to the second page of Google. People are more likely to research for something and change their search terms or whatever than they are to click on the next page to see a new page of results, right? So that's one of the heuristics that we have about information overload. If we can't find it quick, we either give up on it or look for something else. And that can lead to a litany of issues like the confirmation bias. Okay? We can also become addicted to the internet, which is a real thing. People think of internet addiction more in terms of social media, but certainly you can be addicted to searching for things or become obsessed about finding something on the internet, or you can go down like the YouTube rabbit hole, which we've all been down before. You're trying to figure out how to change a spark plug on your car, and all of a sudden, you're Googling, distant planets or why brown is the color brown or whatever, just weird stuff that comes up, and you're just kind of clicking. And you can become addicted to that and not even really know it, because it's one of those acceptable addictions. Right. Again, the thing that's probably the biggest disadvantage is that most of the information that you're going to find on the internet is irrelevant. So you kind of have to ask yourself, how do you sort through it? And that can be a bit tricky in itself. So the internet comes with some thinking errors and problems. And this is not necessarily restricted to just the internet, but these kind of thinking errors occur a lot of the time on the internet, and mostly because we have access to too much information. All right, so the first one we already kind of mentioned is information overload. So if we talk about this from a cognitive psychology perspective, then we recognize that our short-term memory is super short, 7 bits of information plus or minus 2. And we can't pay attention to things, so we oftentimes get distracted by it, which is what the rabbit hole looks like. And there might be different things that we find. You might be reading some information, then there's a link in the middle of it. You follow that link, and all of a sudden you're kind of going down this rabbit trail. So staying attentive can be difficult when you're looking through a lot of information. So you really have to focus on that, but people tend not to because the internet's a big flashy thing. It's kind of like a casino where you just kind of walk around, and the thing that catches your eye, that nice shiny thing, is what you pay attention to. All right. Dual process theory, which is a cognitive theory, says that when we are looking at things that either confront our beliefs or that there's a duplicity of information, then we will tend to flow with the things that make most sense to us based on what we already know. So our experience and expectations, like we talk about in chapter chapter 7, we talked about those in terms of guiding our expectations or guiding what we think, as opposed to looking more objectively. We'll tend to break down and just look for something that's familiar or something that's known to us rather than taking the time to think critically. So when we have a lot of information, we don't think critically. We just try to figure out how to filter through it as much as we can. The last point speaks more to when you are trying to keep track of information. And what happens is that obviously, imagine if you had if you Googled something like how to change a spark plug in your car, and you went to 5 different places and looked at some videos, right? That is a lot of information that you have access to. Imagine replicating that 30 years ago. You'd have to have a pile of books and a bunch of VHS tapes in order to replicate what you just searched for in 15 minutes. And now that we have access to a lot of different information, we look at it very superficially. So we don't look at the depth of the information. It doesn't take time. We have the ability to find the best piece of information and not look critically at all the ones that we're kind of sorting through. So we tend to use these superficial shortcuts. So information overload from the internet can be very problematic in that way. So we have to be careful that we are deliberately looking at the sources that we are trying to discover and quickly making decisions about how good or not good they are before we move on. Because lots of times we'll use these weird things like, I don't like the way that the website looks, so I'm going to go a different website. Okay. Some of the best websites I've seen are ones that were built in the mid-90s based on Netscape, and they have the best information. But if you looked at those now compared to then, you would never give it a second thought because it looks like it's too texty and everything. So we tend to use these cheap heuristics in order to figure out a way to process the information as quickly as we can. So because we have easy access to the information, then we are prone to this idea called confirmation bias, where if we don't like the result that we got, or if we aren't finding what we want, we can look for something else and find the thing that we want. And at worst, we're doing it consciously, trying to find information that supports what we already think. At best, we do it accidentally. And we're just kind of looking for information that makes sense to us. And if something kind of is contrary to our thought process, then we will typically excuse it because we don't want to try to entertain 2 opposing thoughts. Again, that's a heuristic, right? It's a shortcut. So we'll tend to avoid critical thinking and just find things that make sense with what we already believe. And that's kind of the basis of confirmation bias, is finding information out there that supports what you already believe, rather than looking for an abundance of information on both sides of an argument in order to come up with a well-reasoned response. So confirmation bias will rear its ugly head quite a bit in this chapter, in one way or another, maybe not explicitly. And of course, the internet is a place where misinformation lives. We've heard of conspiracy theories too, and how we can fall prey to certain conspiracy theories, especially if they are conspiracy theories about people who we are predisposed to not liking. Lots of times conspiracy theories are linked to political groups or religious groups somehow. So obviously people have vested interests in their belief system, but at least we need to be looking at whether or not something is reasonable and not kind of going down the rabbit hole for misinformation. So we're going to talk about several different aspects of the internet in terms of conspiracy theories and misinformation. We'll start off with internet rumors. And when we talk about rumors, we're usually talking about things that are made up that may have some basis in truth or kind of loosely related to reality. But these also include urban legends. So these stories that we assume are true and have some level of regionality usually for urban legends, like they happen in a certain place. So localities usually have urban legends. Lots of times they're about people or events. There's also fake news. We'll talk a little bit more about fake news on the next slide. But fake news is a term that became popular during the Trump administration, but he did not invent that or make it up. And lots of times when he said that there was fake news, there was fake news. Fake news is not just something that is wholly untrue. It means that it could also be something that is designed to take the recognition or to distract from some other idea. We'll talk more about conspiracy theories too, which are kind of these uncontrolled conspiracies that people come up with. One of the terms that we use instead of conspiracy theory is conspiracy narrative, because theories are rooted on some kind of functional thought process, whereas conspiracy narratives are really just conversations and trains of thought that relate to some kind of conspiracy that's occurring. Okay. So again, the internet rumor is something that happens just because somebody makes up information or links information together that doesn't need to be linked together, but in some kind of reasonably plausible way to some people. A discerning person would not fall prey to an internet rumor, but we are all susceptible to things. So what happened was that somebody had taken a photograph of the Hale-Bopp comet and realized that there was something behind it that was kind of saucer-like. So we kind of talk about flying saucers, UFOs, in a previous chapter. And then the Heaven's Gate cult thought that that was the spaceship that the aliens had that was going to take them all away. It was not true, but the internet rumor mill got going, and it was a particularly susceptible time in internet history to where people didn't realize how awful and hideous the internet could be for misinformation. So a lot of people tended to believe that, and these rumors started to take hold. And they supported the Hale-Bopp conspiracy theory, the Heaven's Gate cult, which in itself was a conspiracy theory. So that's kind of where the internet rumors can kind of start off as. And rumors are kind of like the baseline bit of information that can snowball into something else, like an urban legend or fake news or a full-blown conspiracy narrative. Okay. Excuse me. Again, fake news is information that is purporting to be real. It's misinformation categorically because there's something about it that's not genuine. Lots of times websites that are fake websites will promote fake news, but it can also be fake news that's on any kind of, especially politically leaning, or any other website that has a particular narrative that is trying to advance. So fake news is generally misinformation, but it can also be information that has some root in truth, but it's designed to distract. Okay. What happens a lot of the time is that people who are kind of just getting started reading news for the sake of reading news, not because they're forced to or whatever, people who are trying to get informed for the first time in their lives, like high school and college students, tend to not be very good at identifying fake news because they haven't experienced enough variety in information sources in order to be able to discern what the information source is supposed to be. So a lot of times people will say, well, I heard from this website, or I heard from TikTok, or I heard from Facebook that dot is true. Well, okay. First of all, those are not reputable places to be looking for information. But people don't realize that this thing that they've grown up with as the source for information is not good at information. By the way, you wouldn't want to believe that, because that would suggest that you've been misinformed all along, and people have a tendency to not want to feel like they've been tricked. So fake news is out there. It's hard to detect, but we're going to look again a little bit later at some ways that we can implement this CARE acronym in order to be able to discern fake news, conspiracy theories, and other bits of misinformation. So let's stop for a second and take a look at a scenario. Okay. So an internet news story reported that James Houston, a $500 million Powerball lottery winner, died of a cocaine overdose after winning. But even before getting the money, he took out a loan to purchase a huge house, a kilo of cocaine, and the services of 10 prostitutes. All right, so what do you think of this? Does the timing of it work? Does it make sense? Is there something reasonable about this, unreasonable about this? What do you think about that? Well, the answer is that it never happened. It was a fake story that was circulating on the internet because it's fun to circulate fake internet stories. Snopes.com, which was a fact-checking website, was able to dispel that rumor. Snopes.com is an independent website. It doesn't mean that it is the gold standard for fact-checking. As a matter of fact, Snopes has been wrong before, but it does a pretty good job of dispelling rumors and looking at the facts of the claims that are being made when you have some kind of higher profile internet claim. So in all, a situation like what we just read about, it wasn't true, and plus temporally it doesn't make sense that somebody would do all of that before winning the lottery. Even if people are wishful about winning the lottery, anybody who plays the lottery knows that the odds of them winning are super duper long. Okay, so conspiracy theory, or conspiracy narrative, as I like to call it, it's an alternative account of events that happen. Usually there is some kind of basic premise that people will go along with, but somehow there is some kind of variation in the story that starts to make it implausible or unreasonable. Okay. So the example that is cited here is one that I lived through. It makes it sound old when you say that. I'm not even old and I'm saying old things. What's wrong with me? Is 9/11, and we heard a lot of conspiracy theories about 9/11 and how it could have happened, could not have happened, especially with regard to the Pentagon. And what had happened is that there is a conspiracy narrative that the government planned and executed the attacks on the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon, but rather than Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. Clearly a silly thing to believe, but there was enough evidence that could be spun in a way that seemed reasonable that people believed it. So this conspiracy theory or conspiracy narrative, this conversation about people getting together and conspiring to do something, is usually pretty easy to sort through if you have a reasonable critical thinking mind. What the problem is, though, is that people like to believe in conspiracy theories because they're fanciful, they're fantastic. They have all these wonderful, alluring qualities to them, but generally they are not qualities that one would consider valid. Generally, when we use the term conspiracy theory or conspiracy narrative, we're already suggesting that it's false, okay, which makes sense. Or that it's unfalsifiable, meaning that, we talk about lizard people. Google lizard people, by the way. That's a fun one to look at, that the government is really controlled by a race of lizard people. You can't falsify that because there are people who say that, well, yeah, you can't ever see the lizard people because they have mind control powers and you can't see them unless they want you to see them. Okay. Obviously, you're talking about something that is outside the realm of reasonableness. They're arguing possibility, which was one of the cognitive errors that people have when they're talking about argument. So they're arguing possibility and not plausibility. Okay. Another example of the conspiracy theory is that the moon landing was faked. But the problem is that there is substantial evidence that says that we've landed on the moon. There are a lot of conspiracy narratives out there about the moon landing being fake in terms of lighting and things like that. Okay, fine. And someone says, well, we can replicate this in a studio. Yeah, well, okay, you can replicate lots of things in a studio. Right? Have you seen a Marvel movie? You can do lots of stuff. But that doesn't mean that just because you can replicate in a studio doesn't mean that it happened on the moon. And then furthermore, people were thinking that that it was like some kind of movie production quality from the 1950s and 60s that Stanley Kubrick would have been involved with, and that because his involvement was obvious through the kind of cinematography that was going on, then it must be a conspiracy theory. Again, they are going with they're going with this general idea about some small little detail that could be misconstrued, and it becomes this conspiracy narrative. What makes conspiracy narratives pretty tough to distinguish in some cases is that some are real. So conspiracies are real. Conspiracy narratives or conspiracy theories are not real, or don't have a large amount of truth to them. When people collude on some kind of crime, for example, that's a real conspiracy. A conspiracy just means that you're gathering together to come up with some kind of idea. Okay. So the example of Julius Caesar being assassinated was a real conspiracy. Brutus and the Roman senators all conspired to kill Julius Caesar in a group so that no one of them could be tried for it. But there was evidence for that. And there are lots of valid, true conspiracies. So they're out there, and just because people conspire on something doesn't mean that's a conspiracy theory. It means that there are sometimes real things that people are doing that they're working together on. So those two ideas are not to be confused. All right, so this is kind of a stop and think that's, again, a little bit more rhetorical. But, can you stop and think about some actual conspiracies that have been substantiated or which have been real conspiracies? Not ones that you think have, but that have actually been substantiated. Then can you think of any unsubstantiated conspiracy theories? And if you want to take a second to do a quick Google on some of the conspiracy theories that have been substantiated or not, you could do that just to kind of give yourself a little bit of a heads up on what those might be. There's a couple examples that we can provide here. During the Watergate scandal, this was a real conspiracy where there was a committee. There was a committee that was trying to get Nixon reelected, and they broke into the Watergate Hotel to steal information from the Democratic Party, and that was a real conspiracy. People worked together. They came together for a common outcome. And Watergate was part of the demise of Richard Nixon's presidency, but that was a valid conspiracy. People were working together to achieve some kind of end. In a conspiracy, we generally have different roles of people. So we have conspirators. These are people that are working together to carry out the conspiracy. One of the words that grinds my gears is co-conspirator, which is a silly thing because conspirator suggests that there are more than one and that they're working together. So the idea of saying a co-conspirator is not a valid thing. Then we have the saviors. These are the people who recognize that there is a conspiracy, and they out the people that are part of the conspiracy. They detail the conspiracy, and they try to bust them out. Okay. Then there are the dupes, the people who have been taken over by the conspiracy, who are part of the conspiracy, maybe not as conspirators, but that believe in it, that have the wool pulled over their eyes. Those are the people. Those are the people who accept the explanation of the conspiracy without question. Not that they were engaged in it, but they understand the conspiracy. And the saviors in a conspiracy want to be the people who call the attention to the conspiracy and somehow change the mind of the dupes. Okay. So the plot that we talk about is what the conspiracy narrative is. It's sometimes between sometimes about the struggle between good and evil. And it's not just about good and evil, it's that there is only good or only evil, which is kind of that black and white thinking, or what we call dichotomous thinking. So that Manichaean viewpoint is where most conspiracies are. They're either designed to be good or designed to be bad. And the plot becomes that way, where they're either trying to save somebody from something or something like that, and then other people see it as evil, and there's that constant struggle. And most of the time when people are talking about conspiracy theories, they're either all about it or not about it at all, and there's really no in-between on that. So that black and white thinking that people have that leads them to believe in conspiracy theories is anti-critical thinking, because it means that they're not actually thinking about something, they're just using a shortcut to believing one thing or another. Okay. So if we think that that 9/11 was an inside job, right, we can kind of talk about the rules that are there. So who are the conspirators? Well, if the conspiracy theory about 9/11 was that the government had set up 9/11 to happen, then the conspirators would be the U.S. government. Okay. The saviors would be the people who recognize that, the people who say that there's a conspiracy theory, and that the U.S. government set things up, and in this case, the saviors are the ones who are purporting the conspiracy theory. The conspirators are the people who they're blaming for it, but the saviors are the ones who are trying to tell everybody that this happened, and by doing that, they are coming up with the conspiracy theory. And then the dupes are the people of the world who don't believe that the government did it, that it was some kind of Al-Qaeda operation. So the saviors want to out the conspirators, the U.S. government, and convince the dupes that it wasn't Al-Qaeda, that they were having the wool pulled over their eyes. So in this case, the saviors were the ones who purported the conspiracy theory by blaming the U.S. government. And then the plot is the idea that there is this good and evil difference between the U.S. government and the American people, and that there's some kind of black and white thinking, and that the government is all bad in trying to commit this atrocity and then blame somebody else for it. All right, so the plot is by the way, if you want to learn more about that, I think there's a documentary out there. It's just kind of crossing my mind right now. I didn't prepare to talk about it, but I think there's a documentary out there about the conspiracy theory related to 9/11. Again, if you have some time, it's kind of an interesting thing to look at from a critical perspective to kind of see how conspiracy theories do develop. Okay. Now, at the same time as conspiracy theory, we have to talk about pseudoscience. And we've talked about pseudoscience before. And one of the issues that I want to focus on here is belief perseverance. No matter what the conspiracy is, if there is contrary evidence to it where the conspiracy is found to be false, people have a responsibility if they're thinking critically, to take that new information and adjust the way that they think about it. The problem is that people don't oftentimes take a look at the contrary evidence as evidence that says that they should not believe in their conspiracy. So one of the key features of the moon landing was that the flag was waving in what they called the wind on the moon, when they had some video shots of it. And they said, well, there's no air on the moon, right? But the flagpole does move, and there are people around that were holding onto the flagpole. So what looked like the wind was blowing was just movement of the flagpole, and it was causing the flag to fly. And they replicated it in the vacuum and everything, and it was true. But when that scientific explanation for why the flag was moving in the vacuum of space, the people who believed in the conspiracy, their minds weren't changed. And that's a critical thinking error, because when we are faced with contrary evidence to our belief, we ought to reconsider what we believe and make adjustments to that, and not engage in belief perseverance. Now, because we're talking about critical thinking, we have to think about the errors that people have when they engage in conspiracy theories. And one of them is a pure research topic. We have these tentative ideas about theories until we gain high quality support. All right. So if we have a tentative understanding or a tentative belief about something, then that means that we have the possibility of our belief not being correct. But conspiracy theorists don't believe that. They believe that what they believe right off the bat is correct, which is not inductive reasoning. That means that they are starting with one observation and then they are trying to make a gross generalization or a sweeping generalization or a hasty generalization about the information based on their first thought. And if they are starting with a theory and trying to work down to different types of evidence for it, then they're kind of barking up the wrong tree because they need to be starting with the evidence and not with the theory. If you just say, well, the government's in control of everything, all the bad things that happen, then you're probably barking up the wrong tree because you need to be looking at each incident and then trying to link it to your theory that the government controls everything, not the other way around, or else you start to shortcut the system that says that we're trying to increase the amount of evidence and confirm what we think, not starting with what we believe and then just suggesting that is true on its own. Okay. Another thing that happens is black and white thinking, or that false dichotomy. We mentioned it in the slide before. But what theorists say is that if 100% of scientists do not believe in a human cause of global warming, then it's not true. Okay, so what they say is that either everybody has to believe that global warming is true or it's not true because it's falsifiable, it's fallible in that way. Well, that's not how science works because you don't need 100% of people to believe a theory or to come up with a theory. It needs to be some kind of trend that's present across different trials and across different qualities of research collection. It's not just about whether people agree on it or not. So believing in something like that without everybody agreeing on it is okay to do. That doesn't mean that it's law. It means that it's the theory that we are tentatively supporting, and that you can tentatively support a theory based on the high quality evidence without it being something that everybody must believe in. Now, what is that percentage? We don't know. There's no percentage because the way that we critically think depends on the situation and the task at hand. But what we do know is that based on scientific reasonings that the global warming is occurring at some kind of rate because it's based on scientific understanding of the world, of weather patterns, of climate change, et cetera, et cetera. I think I had just read, and at the time of this recording, that July 2023 was the hottest month ever in recorded history. Now, granted, weather history doesn't go back a long ways, but if we're looking at these trends that are happening over 150 years, and we keep trending toward warmer climates, and it's not just this natural warming cooling cycle like the El Nino and La Nina, then we recognize that there's something else going on, that it must not just be either there is global warming or there is not global warming, that right now we're experiencing a strong variation that is more like global warming than it's not like global warming. So that's kind of where science tends to lie in arguments like that, is that what is this most likely to be? Sometimes we call that the preponderance of evidence, where what is the evidence suggesting is happening? It doesn't have to be 100% that way in order for there to be a strong tendency toward a particular belief. But you can use preponderance of evidence, especially when it's high-quality scientific evidence, like in the case of global warming. Okay. Some of the assumptions of conspiracy theorists is that they use post hoc reasoning, which means that no matter what happens, they go back and try to make a reason for what did happen. What that really means is that they fail to make adequate predictions. Okay, so what happens is that if something if we're trying to prove that the moon landing did happen, and we have the flag example, they might try to go back and say, oh, well, you're on Earth, and Earth has different vibrations than the moon does, or the same people weren't there, or the camera was different, or whatever it was. They'll try to use this post hoc reasoning or after the fact reasoning that makes their theories unfalsifiable. You hear a lot of yeah buts from conspiracy theorists. What else happens with conspiracy theorists is that they have to come up with something that is so elaborate and has so many moving parts that they've kind of created a rationale based on this tentative and very tenuous connection of facts, where scientific theories are called parsimonious. So parsimonious means that you have something that is a collection of a reasonable amount of information. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it's a reasonable amount of information that answers the question without being over elaborate. meaning that it's relatively lean in nature. The arguments that people make about science, scientific arguments, can be lean because if if an argument is scientific, if it's based on good quality and good quantity of data, then you don't have to have all these elaborate ways to explain it. It usually becomes self-explanatory as long as you've articulated it correctly. So these conspiracy theories tend to lack parsimony, in that they have to come up with all these different things. I think we've all seen these movies too, where somebody's trying to explain how something happened and have all these pictures up and all these strings going back and forth to all the pictures, and it's like, whoa, this is way too elaborate to make sense because this is too complicated. Usually if somebody's going to carry out some kind of crime, it's not so complicated that it takes, 15, 20 different nodes of information to make it work. I mean, the movies make it that way because they want to make it cool and interesting, but generally that's not how people work. It's too complicated to keep all that straight. Okay. And then we have peer review process that is part of conspiracy theories, and that usually conspiracy theories don't want a peer review because what that means is that their ideas are susceptible to outside observation, which they really, really don't want. They want only people who believe what they believe to observe the evidence, and once they've come up with their conclusion, that's all they really want to share with people who they're with. Oh, pardon me, I lost the term. Where is it? Dupes. Yeah, of course. With the dupes who are who they're trying to convince of the conspiracy. So the peer review process is lacking. But in good scientific research, peer review is a appropriate thing to do because it allows people to evaluate the quality and quantity of your evidence. Now, last thing we'll talk about with conspiracy theories in terms of where people get information from is when information is web-based versus web-placed. A web-based resource comes from something that is based on a database. Some of the ones that you'll see in the psychology field are PsycInfo, PsycArticles. Sometimes WebMD can be helpful, although it's tricky because WebMD is just one of these diagnostic tools where if you have a hangnail, either it's because you stubbed your toe on something or you have cancer, and there's really not a lot in between. It's weird how that works. But web-based is when something is placed on the internet as some kind of interface between it and good scientific research. So it's not that that's the only place things live, because publications exist and everything. But a database is a resource for you to access good quality research, and that's a web-based resource. A web-placed resource is when people provide information on the internet just by putting it out there. It's not reviewed. It just lives on the internet. There's no repository for it. There's no place where it lives in any kind of organized fashion. It just tends to be put out there. So think of just like a regular .com website. Lots of times news outlets are just web-placed information because there are a lot of editorials and opinions that go on news websites, as opposed to if you're trying to find out some information about, presidential election, there are journals out there that can look at the facts behind what are being claimed by the candidates rather than what the opinions of the pundits are. So web-placed, not so good. Web-based, pretty good. That's kind of a general breakdown of how you might look for references with regard to discerning conspiracy theories or other bits of misinformation. If you're trying to see if a conspiracy theory is true, don't look for a .com. You want to go look for some kind of other resource that supports the facts behind it. Now that we've looked through the nuts and bolts of how to evaluate misinformation on the internet, let's look at a model that will help us organize our thoughts. Then we can apply this model to any kind of information that we come across, especially information that appears to be misinformation. And the title of this model is called CARE, and the subheading of this section of the lecture is called Using CARE to Evaluate Information. Kind of this double meaning. We want to use the model CARE, and also we want to use actual CARE to do it. This is the abbreviated form of the model that we're going to work from. And again, this is in the text, so we're just borrowing from that. We're going to walk through it for the sake of this lecture. So we have CARE: credibility, accuracy, reasonableness, and evidence. And in each step, there are several questions that we'll want to ask ourselves that will help us to decide whether or not what we're looking at is good information or not good information. So with credibility, we want to know, are those sources believable? Are they authentic? And are they trustworthy? Okay. It's kind of the first step. It's like the sniff test. It's like it really doesn't smell right, so it's probably not a good resource. So that's kind of what credibility is for. And then accuracy. Is the information true, factual, and correct? Well, we don't always know that unless we cross-reference it against something else. And we've talked about a couple of websites that are good for that. Places like Snopes.com. There are other watchdog websites that you could look at too that would help you determine if something is valid or not. Then there's reasonableness. Is it plausible, and how consistent are the claims? So sometimes people will make a claim about something and then they will argue all these other things alongside of it, creating this situation where we are not using the parsimony of evidence, where we are just trying to throw everything at it, and the resources may not be objective either. And then the evidence. Does the evidence actually support the claim being made? This is a tricky one because people will oftentimes use the red herring fallacy, and they'll provide you with evidence that might not relate to the actual claim being made, but it's ancillary to it. So we kind of get suckered into believing that it's true. So we'll walk through an example of a pretend website that was made up by the authors. And we'll look through that and we'll identify the different aspects of the CARE model with respect to that model, with respect to the website. So in this lecture, I have the snippets from the text. So I don't recommend trying to read this from the lecture. I mean, you can. I'm not going to stop you. But I'd recommend reading this from the textbook in the section that goes over this made-up website. So take a look at this website, and we're going to talk about the slides that are following. So I will flip through them. If you want to pause and read each one, you may do that. Okay, so you had a chance to pause and look at those if you wanted to. That's fine. This was a website about telepathy, meaning that somebody could do therapy with you without actually having therapy. It relies on telepathic abilities of these certain gifted individuals. Okay, so that's kind of what it is about. And the idea is hopefully for you to understand that this is a fictitious thing and it's kind of bunk, but it's supposed to be. But it will help you give you a more concrete example of when things are obviously hokum. So we're looking at the first aspect of it, the C part of CARE, which is credibility, and there are some questions that we will ask. So first is the author listed, or did a webmaster write the material on the site? Well, there is no author listed that we can see, so we don't know a lot about the source, except for maybe some names that were mentioned. For all we know, there's just a webmaster who created this website and pasted information in there. Maybe it was developed by AI, who knows. But whatever it is, there's no author listed, which is a big red flag because authorship is important for resources. Okay, so what credentials do the author have? So is it a PhD? Is it a doctor? Any kind of training? Any kind of qualifications? In any training? What is it? We can't tell. Because in this particular example, there was no information provided about the author. Okay. So you can see that already we're lacking information about the author, which suggests that something might not be on the up and up. Okay. And is the author's affiliation provided? Generally, people aren't just doing independent research. They're usually doing it as part of another group, a college, an organization, some kind of business entity, whatever it is. There is some kind of affiliation. And in this example of the telepathy website, there is not an example of any kind of affiliation because there is nothing in here about the authors themselves. Okay. So far, the credibility of this is pretty weak because we can't see anything about the people who developed it. Okay. More about credibility. Are there other markers that suggest the source or author is not credible or lacks expertise? Well, when you look at the quality of the writing, it looks like it's kind of disorganized. It's poor writing, is confusing. There are some paragraphs that jumble together multiple topics. Again, that kind of supports the idea that there's lacking parsimony. If you have to jumble together paragraphs to prove a point, you're probably not proving a point. There's some kind of technical terminology in there that only applies to this telepathy, and we learned that when people use jargon specifically for one purpose, that typically it doesn't bear witness to the validity of the information that's being provided. There's also this invoking of Einstein's name that suggested that he was using psychic abilities at some point or studying psychic energy, which is not true at all. So there's a lot of issues with what the author is saying. The author is not actually implementing their own expertise. The author is suggesting that there is some body of expertise, but it belongs to other people, and the author is just kind of like aggregating it into this article so that the reader can be impressed by it, almost like kind of a bogus form of a literature review. So again, we can't see that the author has any expertise in this because there's not a lot of evidence for it. How good are the quality of information provided? Okay, so some of the references are to psychoanalytical journals, and we've learned that psychoanalysis tends to be pseudoscientific just in the nature of the way that psychoanalysis is conducted and the way that the results are typically phenomenological or limited to one person. So it's hard to test it against a larger body a larger sample. So already just based on that fact, it tends to be pseudoscientific, so the claims being made, regardless of the truth of them, cannot be expanded to other samples, which makes it problematic. It also mentions that there's an International Telepathy Association, but doesn't provide independent corroboration of the information. So essentially what's happening in this website is that they're saying, yes, according to the International Telepathy Association, they're making these claims under that guise, but that's like saying that a claim that the best dog in the world is a golden retriever was made by the International Golden Retriever Society. Well, yeah, of course they're going to say that. That's what they're supposed to say. Same thing with if you have the International Telepathy Association, they're going to make claims about something that supports their cause, and it's not going to be corroborated by independent entities or other entities because it would probably contradict the information that they're providing. Okay. So those are kind of some aspects of credibility. You want to ask yourself all those questions when you're looking at some kind of information that maybe appear to be misinformation. So keep those in mind, that when you're testing the credibility, look at each of those questions, and those are also outlined throughout the chapter. You can go back and look at those as well, so you don't have to go back to the slide. The next are the accuracy questions, the A part of CARE. So when we talk about accuracy, we're wondering, are they valid? Are they precise bits of information? Can they be traced down to a certain point in time? So the first question is, how recent is the information provided? So what were the dates of research? When was the last time the site was updated? The problem is that the research that was cited is really old. 1976 is very old research. Not that you can't cite older research, by the way. It is okay to cite old research, especially if you're talking about seminal articles, or you're talking about something historical in a lit review, or you want to review some research that happened a long time ago. That's definitely something that you want to cite and use. But when you are trying to promote telepathy and you want to use information that's verging on 50 years old, that's not going to fly. There's also no mention of when the website was updated. Usually there are copyright dates on websites that say when they were updated. There isn't anything about it in this case. Okay. Accuracy, more questions on accuracy. How complete is the information? Are there some facts omitted, or all sides of an argument represented by evidence? And true to form, when you talk about a therapy like telepathy, they're only going to cite the research that supports telepathy, right? That's the confirmation bias. And that means that we are only going to find evidence that supports the way that we think. And if you're a telepathy place and there's lots of evidence that says that telepathy is bogus, you're probably not going to indicate that on your website. You're only going to talk about the things that support telepathy. So there are clear problems with the choice of what they're going to present in terms of the evidence of their therapy. Furthermore, there are only 3 positive testimonials, and obviously people cherry pick testimonials, right? They're not gonna pick a testimonial that's going to contradict the efficacy of their treatment. So the testimonials were cherry picked. You can almost always not rely on testimonials for accurate information because people either get to pick the testimonial or the people that are making the testimonials are overwhelmingly supportive or overwhelmingly negative, so they tend to be polarized anyways. So really what you're seeing in a testimonial is the most exaggerated form of review, not anything that tends to be honest. And then the last question about accuracy is, does more than one authority, researcher, or independent person corroborate the factual and other claims being made? In this case, no. There wasn't any other entity that corroborated the information. There wasn't any other entity that reviewed the information. It was all based on what the author, whoever that was, of this article suggested was true. There was an allusion to Einstein doing work that was along the lines of telepathy, but that really wasn't true. There was an example of an author in the 1976 article that used personal experience that was anecdotal, and it was about a telepathic dream, and that's how they corroborated telepathy, that somebody had an experience that looked like it was telepathic, so that must mean that telepathy is valid. That is certainly not going to fly when you're trying to make a decision on whether or not something is scientific. One person's dream does not mean that something is scientific. And when we test reasonableness, that's the R in the CARE acronym, we want to know if the information on the website is plausible. Does it seem like, and this is kind of a subjective thing, but remember, we are looking for plausibility, not just possibility. Is it possible that telepathy exists? Probably. It is probably possible in some way that somebody had some kind of connection to somebody else. They can read subtle cues about somebody. They can kind of understand the subliminal context of a relationship. But is it plausible that there are many people out there who have gotten trained or have certain skills to be able to do this? The answer is no. It's not plausible. I would probably even back up a little bit and say that it's probably not even possible to do what's considered true telepathy. But there are other ways that we can read the subtleties of the human body to gain insight into it, but telepathy is really not one of them. Telepathy has not been reliably supported by scientific research in general, so it would be far-fetched to say that there is this kind of scientific therapy intervention that uses telepathy as its key intervention style. Another thing that happens is that there are terms that are used. Remember, when we use jargon or terms that are either fishy or vague or otherwise not supportive of the scientific community, meaning that it's not shared among different disciplines, then it typically makes it feel like it's not reasonable, that it lacks credibility in general. So when you hear the word negative spiritual energies, it's not conventional. It's not something that we hear in psychology or in science generally. Usually that's kind of like a holistic thing, or a religious thing or a spiritual thing, which really isn't linked strongly to scientific research. Again, these things have the possibility of informing people's lives and making you feel better, but it's not what we would call empirically validated. Another thing we have to ask ourselves about reasonableness is the presentation information objective or slanted, biased, or designed to arouse your emotions? Well, clearly in this website, they're trying to arouse emotion, and it's slanted toward a particular way of understanding the human condition, which is that there is some kind of telepathy that can be trained in somebody, and it can be a good therapy. It's really not showing two sides of things. It's not objective. It is certainly biased because they want you to spend money to do the therapy that they are suggesting that you do. Okay. So this is definitely not reasonable from the perspective of objectivity. Is there a conflict of interest? Well, yes, because they're trying to sell you something. That doesn't mean that people aren't allowed to make money based on some kind of intervention. It's okay for people to make money. It's okay for therapists to make money. That's not the point. The point is that their endeavor to make money has strongly influenced what they purport about their therapy on the website. You can get certified for this for only $150, which is interesting because if it's the skill that has to be, in somebody, and then telepathy is this thing that seems to be like too good to be true, and you're only paying $150 for it, it probably is too good to be true. Okay, so really what this is a website that's designed to promote the use of a therapy rather than evaluating how effective it is. Because if it were truly evaluating how effective it was, they would be talking about clinical trials and things. But they're not. They're just talking about all the wonderful things that you can get out of this therapy and not anything negative about it or that it was tested scientifically. More about reasonableness. And by the way, there are many more parts to testing reasonableness because that's one of the things that we can kind of look at right off the bat. Yes, the acronym is CARE, but you can look at these in any order you'd like to. So for reasonableness, are the claims moderate or are they extreme? Well, they're very extreme because they're using charged language, like it's a revolutionary therapy. Okay, fine, it's a revolutionary therapy. How is it revolutionary? What is it doing other than inciting somebody to say, oh, it's this new wonderful thing that no one's ever done before. It's going to turn the world on its head. Okay, revolutionary is a charged term. It's an extreme term, and it's not accurate with regard to the introduction of a therapy. Especially when it lacks testing, and also the claim that it cures people, that's not moderate either. Evidence-based practices almost never say that something cures somebody. We know better than that, especially in therapy, to say that we're going to cure somebody of anything because you can't predict the future. You can't predict what's going to happen in their lives, and furthermore, you can't always know that even if you have a great intervention that it's going to work on everybody. So to say that it cures people is not accurate and valid. Okay. So again, it's not consistent with what's known about psychological science. We almost never say that psychological interventions cure anybody, mostly because they can't all be purported to cure people. There's always this, small group of people, even for a very good and well-validated therapy, that it doesn't work for. And we know that. That's not to say that therapy doesn't work. It's to say that it doesn't work for everybody all the time, which is a very reasonable statement to make. Last is the E in the CARE model. So we're going to test the evidence questions. So the first one is, are the sources, references, or bibliographic citations listed? The answer is no. There was an allusion to a research article, but that was about it. Was research published in a reputable peer-reviewed scientific journal? Not so much. There wasn't anything there. Any sources that were provided were loosely qualified to speak on the topic of telepathy, and there is no indication of published results either. Second question, which type of evidence, if any, is offered in support of a claim? Statements of authority, anecdotes, scientific research? Well, in this case, really it was just some kind of information from a very old article and a statement that was kind of based on Einstein's work that people are generally made up of energy, which is a gross exaggeration of what was meant by that, and a sweeping generalization of the conclusions that come from such statements. So that was really about it. That was a statement of authority, and it really wasn't that much of a statement of authority. It's really just something vague, and even what he was citing was not something that we have the reference to because the authors did not provide it. Okay. And then 3, how good is the evidence provided? Was it based on carefully and systematically made observations under controlled conditions? No. There was no indication that this telepathy had been tested under any kind of controlled conditions, that it worked or anything, especially when you consider the fact that it only costs $150 to register and get qualified to do this intervention after you had some kind of test that you took to be able to do it. Now again, this is a made-up example of what might happen, so the test to take it, who knows what it would have been, but I'm guessing that it would have been easy enough to qualify as many people as possible, because there's a conflict of interest there. because it costs $150 to do it, and they want to sell this stuff, so they want to make it easy to get qualified so that as many people as possible can get qualified. But that's not what they say. They say so that as many people as possible can get helped by this treatment. It's interesting how they switch the importance of who's getting the help versus who is getting the benefit of the money. So they say, well, we want to qualify you so that you can help other people, really, but they want to qualify you so that they can make as much money as possible. All right, so the evidence questions don't really pan out for this either. And they obviously shouldn't, because it's an example that's designed to show you how things can look like they are helpful or that they're valid, but they really aren't. So if we look within the presentation of the website, on page 206, there was a study performed by Dr. Henry Reed, and it was to see the connections of people and to test to see if they had a telepathic connection. And the website said that he conducted an experiment, but was it a true experiment? Okay. So if we think little bit about what a true experiment entails, you need a control group, you need some level of a placebo so that people may or may not know that they're getting some kind of treatment effect. Can you insert a placebo effect into an experiment like this? Is there enough control? Can you randomly select people to different control groups? So when we think of all these questions, is there enough information in that paragraph, that first paragraph, that says that there was a telepathy experiment that was conducted between psychoanalysts and their clients? So is there enough information there to suggest that? Probably not. Could the agreement Reed found in the thoughts of pairs and participants by imagining a psychic connection only be explained by a telepathic connection, or are there other explanations as well? And that's one of the things that we have to answer about cause and effect is, are there alternative explanations for it? So based on looking at the experiment, the answers to those questions are, first, no, he did not conduct a true experiment. There was no control group. So at best, it may have been a quasi-experiment where you didn't have control over who was in which experimental group. So to make a claim so bold as that we can only conclude that this was a telepathic connection is not a conclusion you could make based on the experiment. All right. And what else happens is that when people think, oh wow, they agreed on the verbiage between the two telepathic subjects, does that mean that there's telepathy? Well, no, there are some other explanations for it. There could be coincidental similarities. There could be some kind of matching that was done by the experimenter to make sure that people had similar personality characteristics. So there are, and also the things that they agreed on were pretty vague. So what happened was that, somebody said, "What did you have for breakfast this morning?" And if one person says cereal and one person said they had a bagel, the experimenters would say, "Oh, it's very interesting that these two people both had something that were grains for breakfast." Okay, so that is true, but you make something so vague that it collects many people. It's not really a telepathic connection at that point between the two people. It's just a similarity that people have among common breakfast items. So there are lots of questions about whether or not this is a true experiment and what it means, but based on what we see here, clearly they're not. So what are our conclusions on telepathy? Is it credible? No. We don't have source information. It's not credible. There's lots of information, but it's not good information. Okay. Is it accurate? No, because the information is dated. There are errors in the writing, which means that it probably wasn't reviewed, which means that it was written by one person who probably wasn't careful enough to, not only you're not careful enough to pick up typos, but you also weren't probably careful enough to vet your resources, which was clearly the case. Okay. Is it reasonable? No, because the basic premise is implausible, that ESP exists. And the author also has a potential conflict of interest because they want to sell this training program or this credentialing program so that they can make money. And when that's the case, they're willing to compromise scientific study in order to be able to do that. All right. So, and then is there reasonable evidence for their claims? No, because any claims that are made are low quality evidence. They're testimonials. They are anecdotes. Low quality research, statements of authority just by citing the basic ideas that Einstein was talking about. So clearly, this is not a good bit of research that went into the conclusions on telepathy. All right. So based on all that, we can make the conclusion that telepathy is bunk. This website is only designed to make money. Anything that was written there that supports telepathy is very low quality, and we should be skeptical about any claims that are made about telepathy in the first place because it's implausible. So that's it for this chapter. There is a little bit more in the slideshow, but we're going to save that for either in-class discussion or discussion board based on your learning modality. So use this information from Chapter 8 in order to make good decisions about whether or not something is credible on the internet. It seems like it takes a lot of work to do it, but that's why critical thinking is important, because if you don't do the work, you get susceptible to believing all kinds of misinformation that's out there. So use these steps in order to critically think about information on the internet. Now, if you want to go on the internet and just, surf or whatever and just look at stuff, that's fine, but don't take it as credible research. All right? Don't look at Facebook Reels or somebody's Instagram story or TikToks or anything and believe it to be true. Just be entertained by it. That's fine, but don't believe it to be true. We have to run things through a critical thinking lens, or else we're gonna be susceptible to not only believing misinformation, but continuing misinformation. All right. So look forward to seeing what you can do with this, and we'll see you in the next chapter.